I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly. Today we're drinking the Classic Margarita in honor of the classic true crime, the one in fact that started a genre. Today we tell the story of the murder of the Clutter family, immortalized and somewhat fictionalized in Truman Capote's masterpiece In Cold Blood. It only made sense to start with this case and this drink. The recipe for this week's margarita and next week's margarita are in the description box. And I'm really glad you're here. Let's get started. Richard Eugene Hickok was born on June 6, 1931 in Kansas City, Kansas. He had a relatively stable upbringing with two married parents. His dad was a farmer and he had a younger brother named Walter. Old Dick Hickok was very popular at Olathe High School and he lettered in 9 sports. He was hoping to go to college on a football scholarship, but that didn't pan out. So he started a variety of odd jobs, including ambulance driver and auto mechanic. When old Dick Hickok was 19, he married a 16-year-old, and shortly after their wedding, he was in a very horrible car accident. The car actually flipped, went into a ditch, into some water, and he actually almost drowned. Luckily, a passerby saw him and pulled him out of the wreckage, but it did leave him with a traumatic brain injury and a face disfiguration that made his eyes a little bit lopsided. Many people, including his brother Walter, have said that after the accident, old Dick Hickok changed. He became impulsive, lacked empathy, and he was hella manipulative. In short, a sociopath. And recently I learned this is a thing. There's a ton of studies that are linking traumatic brain injuries with what they're calling acquired sociopathy. Wild. Speaking of impulsiveness, Hickok ended up cheating on his wife and then divorcing her and marrying this mistress. They had 3 children together before they divorced in 1958. I didn't do any research on the kids, and you shouldn't either. Leave the kids alone. On March 15th, 1958, old Dick Hickok was sentenced to a fateful 5 years, of which he served almost none of it, for committing a burglary in Johnson County that included stealing a rifle. While he's there, he meets his cellmate, friend, and future ride or die, and I do mean that literally, Perry Smith. By the way, if you haven't started drinking yet, you probably should. Perry Edward Smith was born in Huntington, Nevada on October 27, 1928. His parents, Flo Buckskin and Tex Smith, not their real names, were rodeo performers. Perry was of mixed Dutch on his father's and indigenous on his mother's ancestry. There's debate on what tribe his mom was from. The family moved to Juneau, Alaska in 1929, where Tex decided to make his living distilling bootleg whiskey. Tex was abusive towards all of his children and his wife, and eventually Flo left him, took the kids, and went to San Francisco. Flo died in a tragic alcohol-induced death when Perry was only 13. He and his siblings were placed in a Catholic orphanage where the nuns abused him emotionally and physically because he wet the bed. He was then put in a Salvation Army orphanage where someone that worked there tried to drown him. In his teenage years, Perry reunited with his dad Tex and they traveled all over the western United States. Perry did find himself in a lot of juvenile detention facilities for petty crimes. Perry's dad Tex and 2 of his older siblings died by suicide, and his remaining sister cut off contact with him. Perry did serve in the Marines during World War II, and he was a decorated Korean War veteran. With one of his first paychecks when he returned from Korea, Perry bought a motorcycle, but he was in a horrible accident. He nearly died, and he permanently disabled both of his legs. He suffered chronic pain for the rest of his life, and he became addicted to painkillers. Perry ended up in jail because of a series of petty crimes, and he ended up in prison for trying to escape from jail. As fate would have it, he ended up in a cell with his future BFF, old Dick Hickok. 1 week after Perry was paroled from the Lansing Correctional Facility and hightailed it out west, a Mr. Floyd Wells, hot off stealing lawnmowers in order to start a lawnmower rental business, ended up in Perry's spot, sharing a cell with old Dick Hickok. As misfortune would have it, when Floyd was about 20 years old, he had worked as a hired hand for Mr. Herbert Clutter, a prominent farmer in Holcomb, Kansas. Floyd had been hired to help with the alfalfa harvest, which, despite me actually being a Kansas native, I literally have no idea what alfalfa is or what it's used for. And I think people have explained it to me before. Floyd left almost no impression on anyone in Holcomb or anyone who worked on the farm. But apparently Floyd had quite the memory. Here are some things that Floyd knew and told old Dick Hickok. 1. Herb Clutter only uses cash. 2. Herb Clutter had a cabinet or a safe or something in his office filled with cash. And 3. Floyd knows the house so well he can draw a diagram including where everybody sleeps at night. And probably some other things too, but it turns out none of these things were actually true. I guess when you're stuck in a prison cell, there's nothing better to do than to make up stories or at the very least exaggerate them. Pillow talk. Herb Clutter dealt in checks only, not cash. There was no safe, and there's no way Floyd could have known what the house looked like because he'd never been inside. But dudes will be dudes, am I right? So at first, old Dick Hickok was a little bit put out by having to share his cell with anyone. He was about to be paroled like a full 4 years early, and he was hoping to just live the rest of his cell days alone. But talk of the safe and the cash started to soften old Dick Hickok towards Floyd, and he got as much information as he could out of Mr. Floyd Wells. The more they talked, the more the plan developed. Old Dick Hickok thought it would be an easy crime. Easy in, easy out. He thought Herb probably didn't even lock the safe. And who would be the best person to bring along for the robbery? His old buddy Perry Smith. You know, the one that hightailed it out west? Because when push came to shove, old Dick Hickok really believed that Perry Smith could kill. And kill he did. After old Dick was paroled, he called up Perry and told him the plan. A score. It'll be a cinch, he said. Drive to Holcomb, rob the Clutter family, and hightail it to Mexico to start a new life. It's unclear when they decided to leave no witnesses, but that was part of the plan. Now it's really time to start drinking if you haven't. Sorry. Holcomb, Kansas was the kind of place where not only did people not lock their doors, many people didn't even have locks for their doors. There were 270 people living there at the time. Everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew the Clutter family. You know the part of Kansas that everyone makes fun of? The flat part? That's not all of Kansas, by the way, if you were wondering. But the flat part of Kansas, flatter than a pancake, they've done experiments and stuff, that's Holcomb. Herbert Clutter and his wife Bonnie, and their children Nancy and Kenyon, who were teenagers at the time, lived in a huge state-of-the-art house on the edge of Holcomb, Kansas. Herb had made his fortune using a new technology to farm wheat, and he'd even been interviewed for the New York Times. Bonnie was an active member of the Holcomb community and a member of the gardening club. Nancy, who was 16 at the time, loved everything that every teenage girl loves. She was a 4-H leader, how Kansas of her, and she was described as generous and kind. Kenyon, who was 15 at the time, loved gadgets. He loved taking apart machines and putting them back together. The two older sisters, Beverly and Eviana, had already graduated and moved away from Holcomb. Perry and old Dick Hickok made their move on December 14th, 1959. They took their stolen black Chevy and stopped along the way to get some supplies. Rope, a flashlight, a knife, and a gun. Once the family was asleep, they entered the house through a side door that was unlocked. They woke Herb Clutter up and demanded to know where the safe was. But there was no safe. This enraged them. Perry and old Dick Hickok bound the family in separate rooms and began to ransack the house for money. They didn't really find much because Herb Clutter dealt in checks. Instead of fleeing the scene, Perry and Old Dick decided to go through with their plan of leaving no witnesses. The murders began with Herb. His throat was slit, and he was shot. Nancy and Bonnie were both shot in the back of the head, and Kenyon was shot directly in the face. The murderers left the house, taking with them a transistor radio, a pair of binoculars, and $50. Hours later, the bodies of the Clutter family were found by Nancy's teenage friend, who had picked her up to take her to Sunday school. Perry and Old Dick Hickok then began a 6-week whirlwind tour of North America. They first head back the 400 miles to Kansas City. From Kansas, it's to Florida, with Old Dick writing bad checks left and right for cash. Then they headed west and into Mexico, where they sold the binoculars and the transistor radio for cash. Once they run out of cash and realize that Mexico might not be the dream life that they are seeking, they headed back across the border into Las Vegas. They were hoping to earn more money to make a trip to Brazil, where they couldn't be extradited. On another note, they may or may not have killed another family of 4 when they were in Florida that December. Clifford and Christine Walker and their 3-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter were murdered in their home on December 19, 1959, in a still unsolved case. Meanwhile, in Holcomb, people are freaked out. Within days, all of the area hardware stores are sold out of locks as people begin to put locks on their doors. Investigators are somewhat at a loss. One of their first suspects is Nancy's boyfriend, who was the last person to see all 4 of them alive. Briefly, the older daughters were considered because Herb had gotten a life insurance policy, a pretty large one that had just gone into effect that very day, but that just turned out to be bad luck, and all 3 of them were almost immediately cleared. An accidental photograph reveals not only one boot print in blood, but a second boot print in dust. 2 suspects are to be considered. Serendipitous. And then Floyd starts to talk. Remember Floyd? Lawnmower guy? Well, Floyd is back in prison, and he hears about the Clutter family murders, and the hair on the back of his neck starts to stick up. And he starts to talk. And when he starts, he doesn't stop. Serendipitous. As the sun set on December 30th, 1959, Las Vegas police drew their guns and arrested a tall, darkish blonde man with offset eyes, and a short, stocky man with a greasy pompadour and a noticeable limp, on parole violations. That was just to hold them for what was to come. It took less than 6 weeks to arrest these men, who had no real connection to the victims, with no fingerprint technology and no DNA technology. It was pretty remarkable and serendipitous. Both men confessed on January 2nd, 1960, and were easily convicted on March 28th. Because they had confessed, their only real recourse was to try and avoid the death penalty, and they did that through an insanity defense, but the jurors weren't buying it. It would take another 5 years of appeals, including going all the way up to the Supreme Court, before eventually their execution date was set for April 15th, 1965. They ate separately but ordered the same last meal: spiced shrimp, garlic bread, French fries, and ice cream with strawberries and whipped cream. Perry Smith and Old Dick Hickok were executed by hanging on April 15, 1965. Old Dick Hickok went first, and he donated his eyes for corneal transplants into 2 different people. Less than an hour later, Perry Smith hung from the same gallows. They're buried side by side in marked graves at Mount Muncie Cemetery, Lansing, in Leavenworth, Kansas. If Floyd Wells had kept his mouth shut, there would have been no reason for Old Dick Hickok and Perry Smith to even go to Holcomb, Kansas. And if Floyd Wells had kept his mouth shut, neither one of them would probably have been caught. Maybe Floyd really did like the Clutters, and he just was so guilty that he felt like he had to come forward. Maybe he was seduced by the $1,000 reward and the potential for a lightened sentence if he ratted out his old cellmate. So, what do you think? Was robbery the real motive? How could things have been different? What about Perry and all the trauma he faced as a kid? Abuse and alcoholism and mental illness. What about Old Dick Hickok? Could a traumatic brain injury really have caused this big of a change in his personality? Could it have made him a killer? What could have changed this? Would you want the eyeballs from a killer? Don't get me wrong. The people that deserve our sympathy are the victims. The Clutter family did nothing wrong, and they should have been left to live long, happy lives. But it is interesting, and what could have been done to stop it, or what explains it, could prevent it from happening again. Thanks for hanging out. I upload every Thursday, and if you want to know more, check out the description box for my socials. See y'all next week.